Welcome to the 8th Congressional District Forum between incumbent Mike Gallagher and challenger Amanda Stuck. The 8th District covers northeast Wisconsin from Marinette and the tip of Door County down through most of the Fox Valley. Tonight's forum is hosted by the Wisconsin Conservative Coalition in support of its vision of an educated, constitutional, and conservative electorate and culture in Wisconsin. I am Ron Zahn, chairman of the Wisconsin Conservative Coalition. Supporting us with this broadcast is the Freedom Project Academy. Freedom Project Academy offers a classical education for kindergarten through high school. The format of our forum will be as follows. Each candidate will be given 3 minutes for introductory remarks. Mike Gallagher, as the incumbent, will go first. Questions will follow with alternating responses from the candidates. Each candidate will be given 2 minutes to respond to each question. Amanda Stuck will be the first to respond to the first and all odd-numbered questions. In closing, each candidate will then be given 3 minutes for concluding remarks. Amanda Stuck will close first. In light of the WCC's emphasis on educating the electorate, we assume the discussion will in every way be civil and in accord with the agreed-upon rules. The moderator this evening is Dr. Duke Pesta, a tenured university professor of English and executive director of Freedom Project Academy.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Duke Pesta, your moderator for this, the 8th Congressional District Forum. I would like to formally welcome Amanda Stuck and incumbent Mike Gallagher to the debate. Tonight we'll be focusing on 10 questions. Our candidates have 2 minutes each to respond to those questions. Candidate Stuck, we're going to begin with you and your 3-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here today. I know that one of the proudest moments for me when I have been serving in my term in the state assembly was when I attended a Wisconsin Conservative Coalition event here in the Fox Valley, and they said I was the first Democrat who had ever accepted their invitation to come to their events. And I think it's really important, especially in these times, that we are committed to coming together and not saying that, oh, those people aren't my party or they think differently than I do on some issues, so I won't go to them. I won't meet with them. I won't talk with them. And so I've always appreciated the opportunity to come to the Wisconsin Conservative Coalition events and talk with you and hear your points of view. I know it has certainly made me a better legislator to engage in conversation with all of you. So I'm thankful for the work you're doing. I'm thankful for the opportunities that you have presented to me to hear from you and work with you and talk to you. It might surprise some people to know that my great-grandfather was actually a Republican mayor of Brillion, Wisconsin, a long, long time ago. So I certainly don't look at my conservative or Republican colleagues and say that these are not people that I can work with. These are people who have been my family members, my friends, and I will always be committed to working with anybody, no matter how they identify politically, if they want to work on issues facing the people here of Wisconsin. I am running because I do think that we need more people in Congress who have backgrounds like mine, who know what it's like to actually work 3 jobs and still struggle to get ahead. People who have husbands like mine that are sheet metal journeymen and who really face the consequences of the economy and the decisions that politicians make in Washington. And I look forward to talking about these issues and about my background and how that makes me the best candidate to serve in Congress.
Well, thank you to the Wisconsin Conservative Coalition, especially Ron Zahn for coordinating this. Ron, you have a great radio voice, and this is a very impressive technological accomplishment here. Listen, every cycle, it seems like politicians come to you and say, this is the most important election of our lifetime. You know, if we don't vote this way or that way, the republic will implode, or this election is life or death. And I just would say, as someone who served overseas and spent a lot of time in countries where elections were quite literally life or death, or you could be killed for, you know, the type of religion you belong to or the political party you belong to, I think that rhetoric can be a bit exhausting. But while in good conscience, I can't tell you that this is the most important election of your lifetime. I do think it is a very important election, and I do think in some ways it is the simplest or the most basic or the most fundamental election of our lifetime. And by that I mean that instead of spending our time debating detailed policy proposals, we find ourselves in many instances relitigating some of the most basic principles that our country was founded upon. We find ourselves debating simple things like whether we still believe that freedom of speech is an inalienable right or that we can simply silence those we disagree with. We find ourselves debating whether we still believe in the rule of law, whether we support our men and women in law enforcement, or whether we believe they should be defunded and removed from the communities they aim to protect, and that they're best equipped to keep us safe from harm. We find ourselves debating whether we respect property rights or believe that it's somehow acceptable to allow mobs to take over cities and burn down our businesses that stand in their way, or whether we believe in the grand achievements of our nation's strongest liberators, whether they're Abraham Lincoln, whose statue was just torn down earlier this week in Portland, or Hans Christian Heg, whose statue was torn down in our own state in Madison, which gets to a bigger question, whether we believe that America is a good country, a country that should be proud of its history, as imperfect as it is. And so that's the question I would pose to this group tonight. Do we still believe that we are the good guys? Do we still believe that we are the greatest country in the history of the world, that we're capable of tackling any challenge that stands in our way, and that we have more in common with our neighbors than we have apart, and that we are still the best example of freedom for the rest of the world? Now, it's a shame that we have to go back and relitigate such non-controversial ideas, but that's where we stand. Fortunately, America has a proud history of handling its disagreements at the ballot box, and voters have an opportunity to express where they stand in this moment in our history. So tonight, I welcome this opportunity to make clear where I stand on these issues. I look forward to the debate. I thank my opponent for being part of this, and I will do my best to keep it civil and substantive, and ultimately that's the American way.
Okay, we're going to move to the 10-question part of the debate. And Amanda Stuck, you're going to go first, and remind everybody that you have 2 minutes to answer the question. The very idea of Black Lives Matter is to some people unifying and to some people polarizing. Is it possible to be unifying when to say all lives matter is a problem? And how do we separate Black Lives Matter from some of the riots, some of the anarchy, some of the chaos in the streets? How would you counter that kind of anarchy and reestablish law and order? And do you personally support defunding the local police?
This is a great question because this is something that we, of course, are seeing even right here in the Fox Valley. Protests here, people calling for change. And what I will say is there's no reason that this should be a partisan issue. When we see constituents calling out for help, saying that they need change, that their experience is negative, that their experience is hurting them, we as representatives should listen to that and do something about this. I certainly support the police. I have written bills with police officers from the Appleton Police Department in my time in the Assembly. I've been endorsed by police unions in the past. I do support our police officers. But the truth is, we see examples over and over again where particularly people of color have a different experience with the police than we do as white people. And we have to be honest about that. We have to be honest about the changes that need to be made in order to make sure that we really are serving people well. And I'll just give an example of this. So I'm actually a healthcare worker as one of my part-time jobs. I'm a licensed personal care worker. And to get that license, I actually had to go through training to learn how to get out of a chokehold when one of my clients is choking me without hurting my client. I had to learn how when my client is biting me, that I have to lean into the bite and not hurt my client. So if we expect personal care workers making $11, $12 an hour to be trained how to get out of situations like that without hurting their clients, we can also expect the same from our police officers, that they can handle these difficult situations because they are the best, they are the bravest and the best. They can be trained, they can get what they need, the resources they need to better handle these situations so we don't see citizens being shot by police officers and we don't have to see people calling for this kind of change.
Candidate Gallagher, your 2-minute reply.
Well, I would respectfully disagree, and I think we have to do everything possible right now to stand unequivocally and strongly with our law enforcement professionals here in Northeast Wisconsin, who have set a national example on how to reach out to the local community, listen to the concerns of the local community, but ultimately do their job, which is to keep the local community safe. And quite frankly, I think we need to do a better job of pushing back on some of the irresponsible and dangerous rhetoric that we've seen coming from leaders in our own state. For example, mere hours after the Jacob Blake shooting, Governor Evers indicted the police officers involved before he had any of the facts. He condemned what he called merciless violence from our police force. Lieutenant Governor Barnes went further. Before any facts had emerged, he called this a vendetta carried out against the Black community. He and many others perpetuated the lie that Jacob Blake was just trying to break up a fight. And Joe Biden came to our state and said the police officers should be charged. And then Senator Harris came to our state and said similar remarks. All of that will have the practical effect of demonizing law enforcement professionals in Wisconsin, which will then in turn discourage young Wisconsinites who are graduating from our high schools right now from wanting to pursue a career in law enforcement, which means we'll get less qualified, dedicated police officers, which means our communities will become less safe, particularly the very communities that the BLM movement is purporting to try and help right now. There's no question that our police officers would welcome more resources in the form of enhanced training on de-escalation or enhanced mental health professionals. They would be the first to tell you that. But quite frankly, this national effort that has been parroted by every Democratic leader in our state to defund the police is a dangerous idea. And look no further than what happened in Kenosha and what's happening right now in Wauwatosa. We do not want that to happen in Appleton, Green Bay, or anywhere else in Northeast Wisconsin.
Thank you both. Question number 2, and we'll begin with candidate Mike Gallagher on this one. There is absolutely, if we set aside for a moment the posturing and the contradictory statements about the Supreme Court over the last 10 to 12 years from both Republicans and Democrats, we know that it is 100% constitutional that this particular president has the right to go ahead and appoint a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg right now. That's constitutionally true. Given that this election very well may be fraught and end up in the courts, how important is it that the Republicans add that 9th seat so that you have an uneven number should all of this electioneering end up in the courts? Candidate Gallagher, you're first.
Well, let me start with something you alluded to in your question, which is the idea that this is constitutional, which is, of course, correct. But Vice President Biden went out, I think, yesterday and said it's unconstitutional what the Republicans are doing right now. That reflects a complete ignorance about what is actually contained in the Constitution. The precedent is absolutely clear. The president has the right to nominate a candidate for the Supreme Court, and the Senate can choose whether to consider that nomination. People can disagree about what the precedents that have emerged since then, but constitutionally, there is no question. And I would further say the most important thing, honestly, regardless of whether you are a progressive liberal or a conservative Republican like me, you should want a Supreme Court justice that is a constitutionalist, someone who adheres to the Constitution and will interpret the law as it is written, not interpret the law as if they are a super legislator, which is, I'm afraid, the direction that the left wants to take the court. So I think it's critical that we have a full set of 9 justices, if for no other reason than we need to guard the Constitution itself. Furthermore, I would note with trouble or in concern what I've seen in recent days, this attempt to evade answering the basic question of packing the court, which would overturn 150 years of precedent, which Joe Biden in the past said was a crazy power grab scheme. We should all be united against the idea of court packing. I have a constitutional amendment that would set the number of Supreme Court justices at 9. To pack the court would be to destroy the court as we understand it, and by extension, to destroy our constitutional order. I think every person who is running for office should be forced to answer that question. And at the end of the day, legislators have to be in the business of passing clear legislation, not outsourcing their work to unelected justices. That is a perversion of our constitutional system.
Candidate Stuck, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Thank you. Certainly, if the question is, does he have a constitutional right? I would say, yes, he has a constitutional right to put forward a justice, right? I think the question, and where you see people upset, is how this was handled under Obama compared to what we see now. So certainly, does he have the constitutional right to do that? Yes. Do some leaders in the Republican Party probably have some soul searching to do? Should they maybe question themselves when they look their children in the eye and say, am I truly acting in a moral, correct way, a way that I would really want my children to follow, that I would be proud to look my mother or my father in the eye and say, this is how I have chosen to act as an adult person? When under one president, I say we can't do this in an election year, and under another president, I say that we can. I think it's hypocritical, and it's exactly why people hate politicians, why they hate politics, why they hate Washington, because it's all a game. Nobody has the integrity to do the right thing. Everybody puts their party above the people here in Northeast Wisconsin, and I think that is what is absolutely wrong, and why we need people, again, who are actually from here, who actually have real life experience and don't have time for these games, who really want to do the right thing each and every time, not just when it's for their party.
Okay, thank you. And so this next question will begin with candidate Stuck. Very simple. Do you believe that man-made carbon dioxide emissions are generated by fossil fuels are a threat to life on this planet? And if so, what would your plan be, given that the recent treaties that have been accepted and not accepted don't often include the major polluters like China and India as part of the deal? Why is it only Western countries that are being asked to set back? What would you do if you were in charge?
There's no doubt the science is very clear on this, that we are contributing to global warming. And this is one of our biggest threats. Even the military has identified this as a threat to our survival and our security. There's no doubt it's happening. There's no doubt that we're contributing to it. When we look at working with our allies internationally on this issue, what really frustrates me, especially being a teacher and a mom, is this finger pointing about, well, they're doing it, so why can't I? Or we should too, because they're doing it. It sounds like what I hear on the playground every day in school. Certainly, we should be working with all other countries to address this, because we can't do this alone. We are a world that has to work together to address this. And that's exactly why we need agreements, that Trump has taken us out of, like the Paris Climate Agreement. We need to work with other countries to try and address this. Finger pointing, complaining about other countries, that doesn't help. We really need to come together. We need to invest in renewable energy. We need to work with other countries to make sure they have access to this technology and can invest in this as well. And I know that renewable energy isn't even just about climate. It's about jobs. Again, having a husband who's a sheet metal journeyman, I know that he has had jobs on wind turbines when the state was investing in those. He's also had jobs in frac sand mines. Frac sand mines are not sustainable jobs. They often bring in outside people to do that work and hire very little local labor. So the truth is that the renewable energy is really where sustainable jobs are going in the future.
Candidate Gallagher, 2 minutes to reply.
So I agree in part that I believe humans are contributing to climate change. I would disagree with the idea that the Paris Accord did anything to improve environmental outcomes. Like Kyoto and Copenhagen agreements before it, the Paris Agreement failed. And I don't think our focus should be quadrupling down on failed approaches. Only a handful of countries, I mean, it's true, are actually meeting their Paris Accord goals, which tells you all you need to know. In fact, the Paris Agreement allowed China to increase its emissions for decades, which won't peak until 2030. So even if fully implemented and extended for 80 years, Paris would only reduce the temperature by 0.4 degrees. And in light of UN projections that climate change could increase temperatures by 7.2 degrees, taken on its own merits, the Paris Agreement fails. I guess I would also disagree that there isn't a role for finger pointing, or I don't know what the word is, but the fact is we should not turn a blind eye to what China is doing environmentally, in terms of its human rights, the fact that it has over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in a modern-day concentration camp, the fact that it is threatening our military and our military allies in Indo-PACOM, the fact that it is coercing American companies and American industries like the NBA to bow down before it and embark on un-American behavior. The Chinese Communist Party is the foremost foreign policy threat we face and will face for decades to come. We are at the early stages of a new Cold War, and this Cold War will have competitive aspects like an economic competition that requires us to invest in transformative technology like micro nuclear reactors so that we can win that race with China. but would also have military dimensions, and it will also have human rights dimensions. And so to turn a blind eye to what China is doing, or to try and work with China because we believe that climate change is more important than the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, I think would be misguided.
Well, candidate Gallagher, you sort of anticipated by accident the next question, and you do go first. What should be done about the relationship between the United States and China? Both internationally and nationally, China certainly has its share of problems. What would be the best way of addressing China as a trade partner, but also taking into account their human rights violations?
Well, first, I cannot stress enough how important the progress that we've made in the last 4 years have been. And what I find most remarkable at a time of intense division in this country is that even President Trump's loudest, most vocal critics who hammer him every single day are actually not taking issue with the fundamental premise of his national security strategy and national defense strategy, which is to say that China is our pacing threat, our paramount threat, and by extension, Indo-PACOM, not CENTCOM, i.e. the Middle East, is our priority theater. That is a remarkable reorientation of U.S. foreign policy, the likes of which we have not seen since the end of the old Cold War. The second thing, since you referenced trade, while I have been critical at times of the authority under which so-called Section 232 tariffs have been levied against a lot of our allies, there is no question that when it comes to the so-called Section 301 tariffs, which is our tough economic approach to China, that has been a positive development. And we need to maintain that tough approach against China. And honestly, the best way that we can continue to push back on Chinese intellectual property theft, which costs us over $300 billion a year, has been called the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. The way in which China games all of these international trade fora, whether it's the WTO or take your pick, is to stay aggressive on the 301 front and continue to do bilateral trade agreements like the president got done with USMCA. We have an opportunity to do the same with Taiwan, and we have an opportunity to do the same with the UK over the next 4 years. And so I very much hope we do not let off the gas when it comes to that tough economic approach to China. But at the end of the day, we are going to have to modernize our military to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from intimidating us or invading Taiwan by force.
Candidate Stuck, you have 2 minutes to reply.
China is definitely going to be a big issue for the next Congress and something they are going to have to deal with. Unfortunately, we have an administration supported by Mike Gallagher that has not actually stood up to China. In fact, China's power has grown under Gallagher and Trump's watch. In fact, their trade negotiator stated that his tweets make him easy to read and thus the best choice for negotiations. So the fact that he tweets whatever he thinks in the middle of the night makes it easy for foreign leaders to read him and to know what he's thinking and where he's coming from when they go into negotiations. Trump actually has said of the Chinese leader that he is a great guy, that his detention camps were the right thing to do. And yet Gallagher has been silent on that and not pushed back on him for saying these things while he's also claiming to be outraged by them. So we need leaders that will actually stand up even against their own party when they are making comments like this. Part of the reason why China has continued to grow in its power and influence around the world is because America has continued to isolate itself and stop working with allies. And China has seen that as a prime opportunity to get in there and grow their power to make allies with former allies of ours. China is growing its influence because it goes into countries and gets them into debt. America has simply decided to abandon these countries and forget how we need to work with other countries. If we really want to beat China, our best bet is to go into these countries, build relationships, make sure that we're helping them to invest in infrastructure so that they don't need to go to China to depend on them for money and financing, which makes them under the influence and power of China. We need somebody who will really understand this, who can negotiate, who will actually do the right thing. And I would simply ask yourself, are you actually better because of the tariffs? Is your pocketbook better? Do we have a better trade deal with China? We don't. We simply don't.
This next question is going to be candidate Stuck. You're going to answer this first. Our U.S. Constitution has served the country and the world relatively well for the past 200 years. It has been a source of stability, generally speaking. But we live in an era now where people are beginning to question that. There seems to be a debate between whether or not the Constitution should be followed as the rule of the law or if it should be adapted to meet the needs of modern times. I'd like to ask your opinion on where you stand with regards to the Constitution, and especially frame that answer through the question of the Second Amendment, please.
Your question is, do I support the Constitution? Absolutely. I know over my time in the Assembly, there have been many calls for us as legislators to support opening up the Constitution for amendments. And I do think that's a very serious issue and not something we should take lightly. Once you open up the Constitution, any change that could possibly be made could greatly impact our democracy, how we live here in the United States. And so I don't think that's something you take lightly, and no changes should ever be taken lightly when it comes to the Constitution. Comes to the Second Amendment, I certainly have never supported or been a proponent of changes to the Second Amendment. That is in there. It should stay in there. It is something I support.
Candidate Gallagher, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Well, the Constitution is, to steal a phrase from Abraham Lincoln, the frame of silver protecting the apple of gold, which is the Declaration of Independence, which reflects our highest aspirations as Americans, that we are dedicated to the idea that all men are created equal. And the Constitution allows us to protect inalienable rights that are given to us not from government, but from God. And if we don't protect that, then we don't have a constitutional republic anymore. I swore an oath to defend the Constitution when I was in the Marine Corps. It's the same oath that I swore when I served in Congress, and that is the first question I ask myself whenever I'm considering legislation: is this constitutional? And I would, maybe to tie it to the last question, I would imagine there are a lot of people on this call who are still angry with me for times at which I've disagreed with the White House on constitutional issues, such as the expansion of executive authority or emergency authority. But I do believe that the fundamental distortion of our Constitution that's happened for the last 5 decades, and honestly, it's happened under both parties, is that the legislative branch, which is supposed to be the dominant branch, has surrendered its authority to the executive branch, which is less accountable to the people, and we have to fix that. When it comes to our Second Amendment, I mean, look at the biggest form of revealed preference over the last 6 months. We have millions of Americans buying guns for the first time. Why is that? Because they don't feel safe amidst an increasingly dangerous environment as we demonize and try and defund the police across America. This should tell us that that is the wrong policy, and it should also remind us of the importance of the Second Amendment. I have stood strongly for the Second Amendment over the last 4 years. I will stand in opposition to attempts to repeal it, and I just would submit respectfully that Joe Biden's agenda on guns is concerning, and he wants to put Beto O'Rourke in charge of his gun policy, which is a bad move.
Candidate Gallagher, you will answer this question first. Since it was legalized in 1973, more than an estimated 20 million African-American children have not been born. Abortions are disproportionately formed routinely with African-American women. When we have the phrase Black Lives Matter, and it's almost dangerous to say anything like all lives matter, does this constitute a kind of genocide? And is this something that we should be concerned about as people who would otherwise support the idea that Black Lives Matter?
Well, it shouldn't be dangerous to say that all lives matter. To me, that is an obvious proposition. And I would go further and say in Wisconsin, I've come to believe that we are failing Black and Hispanic Wisconsinites. But that's not a function of racist cops that wake up every day trying to hurt people because of the color of their skin. It's just not. It's a function of a failing public educational system that is not only failing to adequately equip our young Wisconsinites to become adults, but also teaching them dangerous ideas like critical race theory and other things that distort the very nature of America's constitutional order. How is it possible that we are moving towards a situation in 2020 where race suddenly matters more than it did 20 years ago? I think in any estimation, we're moving further away from Martin Luther King's dream of being judged by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. As for the issue of abortion, I understand it's an incredibly thorny issue, but I have personally been pro-life my entire life, mostly because of my family upbringing. I also am now a father. I have a 3.5-month-old daughter, and it occurred to me the moment I held her in my arms for the first time that this is a human being who has been alive for quite some time. And the idea that you could kill any child up to the moment before birth, to me, is repugnant. It's horrifying. We must do everything possible to oppose late-term abortions. And finally, I would say it used to be a matter of bipartisan agreement that taxpayer money shouldn't be funding abortions. That was something called the Hyde Amendment. It's something that Joe Biden used to support, and now he's run away from. Unfortunately, I think that reveals we're moving in the wrong direction on this issue, and the fact that fringe ideas like abortion up to and perhaps after the moment of birth have absolutely no place in our society. We need to stand strongly for life.
Candidate Stuck, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the question was. If it was about all lives matter, if it was about abortion. But I think the question was about abortion, so I will answer that. So just the other day, a friend of mine who recently survived breast cancer shared a story about a woman who was in her support group who found out that she was pregnant shortly after she found out that she had breast cancer. So basically, her choice was to terminate the pregnancy so she could get treatment for her breast cancer and save her life, or to have the baby and not get treatment and die. That was the choice that she was faced with. What I would ask people who claim to be pro-life is which life would they choose in that situation? What would be the right choice for them? The truth is, women face impossible choices all of the time. I have heard stories as a legislator about women who have to make terrible choices. Women who are told that their babies are born with conditions that will mean they will die the minute they are born. So to force them to carry a baby for 9 months that they know will die the second it is born is cruel, and it's wrong. And certainly it's interesting to hear Mike Gallagher talk about abortion when he will never have to carry a child. He will never know what that's like. I can tell you, as somebody who was a single mom who had my son, if I had to have another baby during that time, I wonder who would have paid for us to eat? Who would have paid the bills? If I had to carry another baby to term during that. These choices are not that easy. And it should be up to a woman, it should be up to her doctor and her to decide what is best for her and her family.
Now, this next question, Candidate Stuck, you're going to start first, please. It seems to be a foregone conclusion that if we're going to improve the lives of inner city children, we have to give them access to quality education. Why is it that parents have the right to choose all sorts of things for their children, but don't necessarily have the right to choose better schools than the ones that have not been able to serve them very well? Do you believe that school choice should be something that parents actually have?
Is that me first?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, so school choice. I mean, certainly I think parents should have the choice to send their kids to whatever school they want. The question is simply about how does that get paid for? And the truth is we can't afford to pay for 2 school systems. We've seen it right here in Wisconsin where we are essentially doing that right now. We are paying for 2 school systems. The taxpayers are paying for 2 separate school systems. Their taxes have actually gone up because of that, and that's not sustainable. Our public schools are providing great education. And the truth is, if they are suffering or if there is a reason why parents are not satisfied with what they have in the public schools, it is simply because there are not enough resources being put into our schools right now. And so diminishing those resources even more to run 2 school systems, both a public and a private school system, is not the answer. We need to make sure our schools are fully funded so that they can provide the best education for every single student. But if somebody wants to send their child to a public school, they certainly have the right to do that, but they should be the ones paying for that then, or that church or that community should be figuring out how to fund that system, not the taxpayers paying for 2 systems and paying increased taxes to do it.
Candidate Gallagher, you have 2 minutes to respond.
I think here we have an honest disagreement. I just think it's empirically untrue to suggest that the problem is inadequate funding. If you look across America, and certainly the same is true in Wisconsin, you'll start to notice some really interesting data that suggests we've increased per pupil expenditures dramatically and consistently over the last few decades, and yet educational outcomes are getting worse and worse and worse. America, which used to rank #1 on the International PISA exam, now ranks somewhere around 25th. In Wisconsin, 6 out of 10 of our kids can't read at grade level. If kids can't read at grade level by 8th grade, they have almost no chance of succeeding afterwards in their educational journey. I think this is a problem we all need to turn our attention to. And I've been an active proponent of the choice movement, but I would be the first to concede that choice is a necessary but insufficient condition for student success in Wisconsin. There's 2 problems. One, in rural areas, it's less useful for a kid to be able to drive an hour to go to a choice school, even if it's a dramatically better school. And even in urban Milwaukee, where choice has saved thousands of kids who were trapped in failing schools, they still in many cases leave behind a failing school that we need to fix. Why is that? Well, part of it is because of the mismanagement and outright corruption with Milwaukee public schools and an insufficient attention that's being paid to the funding system as it exists in Wisconsin right now. I believe that the next phase for choice in Wisconsin is that dollars should follow students, regardless of which school their parents choose to send them to, and not be laundered through a series of middlemen that often take money off the top, take money out of the classroom, and use it to pay administrators as opposed to great teachers. And at the end of the day, we know what works. Great teachers and great principals will equal great educational outcomes.
Candidate Gallagher, you're going to also answer this question first. Every election, there's a raging debate about health care. What is the role, according to you and your platform, what is the appropriate role of government in the delivery or sustaining of health care?
Well, I think one thing that we should all agree on is that to dramatically expand the role of government in American healthcare would be going in the wrong direction. And that's what Medicare for All would be. It would be a government takeover of our healthcare system. It would effectively leave us with socialized medicine. And I think the problem with Medicare for All, it's not just that it would dramatically increase costs, which it would. It's not just that it would jeopardize, if not destroy, coverage for the hundreds of millions of Americans who have employee-sponsored private insurance. And honestly, it would jeopardize Medicare as it exists right now, because Medicare for All would effectively mean Medicaid for all, and we should be doing much better than a government takeover of our healthcare system. So point 1 would be to resist the efforts that are now mainstream among the left to embark on Medicare for All, which would effectively destroy our healthcare system, reduce coverage, increase costs, and lead to a less healthier population. The second thing going forward is I do think, as a conservative, we need to learn lessons from our failure, quite frankly, to reform the healthcare system when we had an opportunity to do so in Congress. I think there is widespread bipartisan agreement on the idea that a starting point principle for any reform going forward is to protect people with pre-existing conditions. As you know, I've been quite outspoken on the issue of price transparency, because good luck trying to decipher a medical bill when you get it after you've had a costly procedure. The other thing we need to do is tackle surprise billing, which is an easy thing we should tackle. But more broadly, I think we need to do everything possible to cut out all the middlemen that get between a patient and a doctor in healthcare. And we can do that with things like direct primary care, figuring out telemedicine, bringing transparency and reforming the nature of PBMs that are responsible for a dramatic increase in our drug costs, and then ultimately getting a healthier population.
Candidate Stuck, you have 2 minutes to reply.
I think ultimately the role of government in healthcare is to protect citizens. I don't know if Mike has ever sat on the phone with a constituent who's crying because they're going to die if they can't get access to healthcare and they have no options. They've tried all the programs, they've applied, they don't qualify, they just make over the amount to qualify or just under, or something that they don't meet the qualifications for something that's out there currently. But it's a terrible thing to listen to somebody cry and talk about how they're going to die because they can't get care. The role of government is to make sure that never happens. And I can tell you from my personal experience that I've been there. When I was a single mom, I actually was on Medicaid. And I sat there calling every single dentist in the phone book, trying to find somebody that would take my son because he had a toothache. And nobody would take us because we had Medicaid. it is the worst feeling. I remember closing the phone book and just crying because I could not sit there and just watch my son be in pain and not get help. So the truth is, these programs don't always work. Just because you have health insurance doesn't mean you have access. And that's because doctors and dentists can't afford to take Medicaid patients because they actually lose money on seeing us. So the truth is, these programs do need to be changed. They need reform because they don't work as they are. But that is the role of government, is to find solutions, to make sure that nobody has to go without care simply because they don't have the right insurance or they can't afford it. It is also to make sure that insurance companies are held accountable, to make sure that things are affordable. You know, Mike Gallagher voted against H.R. 3, which would have helped drive down the cost of prescriptions. When representatives hear from constituents saying, I can't afford my medicine, it's their job to do something and not vote against a bill simply because Democrats put it forward. So it is our job to find solutions to the things that are hurting our constituents and to make sure there are programs in place to help them.
Candidate Stuck, you will answer this question first. Please respond to it first. The United States, like pretty much every country that has ever existed, has an imperfect past. Yet there are powerful forces in politics, in academia, and in the streets demanding a transition to a more socialist form of government. Where do you stand on the question? Does America have to be completely remade from scratch? Is socialism something that in the future would benefit America and the American people?
I'm certainly not a socialist, and I think we have a great country. What is really at stake right now, and what the threat is right now, is the Trump administration supported by people like Mike Gallagher. They are the ones who are threatening our democracy, saying they will not honor democratic elections, saying that they don't have to abide by the Constitution and the rule of law. They are the threat, not people that are trying to point out things that we do need to address and fix, like healthcare and the environment. They are not the threat. The people who are honestly saying that they are going to use the government to go after their political opponents, that they're going to use their power to help their families and friends and attack people they don't like, that is what really is the risk to our country right now. I don't support socialism. I don't want us to be a socialist country, but I do want us to be a country that does actually live by our Constitution, where we really do have the rule of law and where political leaders are held accountable for their actions.
Candidate Gallagher, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, I would say right now we find ourselves in an existential competition with a communist adversary, as I alluded to before, in the form of communist China. And the only way we lose this competition without even engaging in it to begin with is if we defeat ourselves. And I fear that this increasing narrative to paint America as an evil country, as a systemically racist country, as a country that should tear down its past and tear down statues, as we've seen with statues of Lincoln and abolitionists in Madison, is a recipe for failure. And the fact that a majority of millennials have favorable views of socialism tells you that we failed from an educational perspective to apprise the next generation to the horrible evils of socialism and certainly communism. I have faith in America, however, even in this dark moment. And I have faith in America because this is still a country where you can disagree with your president, as I have, honestly, on multiple occasions. You can call your congressman names if you want to, or deface his signs in the middle of the night. And we don't have a bunch of jackboot thugs that are going to round you up in the middle of the night. What we have, however, is a situation where increasingly our technological elite is turning a blind eye to communist propaganda that's infiltrating America. We've seen it particularly pronounced on social media throughout this pandemic, where Chinese Communist Party officials have spread dangerous propaganda. It's being parroted by the mainstream media, and it's confusing a lot of Americans. And if Americans no longer know what's true and what isn't, how are we ever going to be able to come together and solve problems peacefully? So this is something we really need to remain vigilant about.
Okay, this is our final question of the evening, and we're going to start with candidate Gallagher first. There have been two surprising developments in the Middle East recently. The President of the United States has moved the embassy to Jerusalem to acknowledge the capital of Israel, and you have the Abraham's Peace Accord, which have normalized relations for the first time between the United Arab Emirates and the Israelis. What do these accomplishments and or policy decisions, what do they mean for peace in the Middle East moving forward?
Well, I think it is a remarkable accomplishment. I remember when, in the midst of the 2016 campaign, there was a debate about a few things. One, whether to get out of the Iran nuclear deal, and two, whether to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And the foreign policy class, all the elites that sit in think tanks that have been wrong about U.S. foreign policy for a couple decades now, all said, well, one, you can't get out of the Iran nuclear deal. It would destabilize the region. And two, if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, it would destabilize Israel and we'd have a second intifada on our hands. Neither of those arguments turned out to be correct. I commend the president for making the decision. And what we have done now is effectively build a regional alliance structure with our traditional allies. We've actually reinvigorated our alliances, our longstanding allies in the Middle East, that our previous president threw under the bus, particularly Israel. And now we actually have a recipe for prolonged stability that will hopefully allow us to responsibly reduce our force presence over the next decade so that we can increasingly focus on Indo-PACOM and the threat posed by China. And at the end of the day, that is a critical thing we have to do. And here we have the blueprint for how we do it. How we can achieve a high impact in the Middle East with a very light blueprint. And ultimately, what is most promising about that approach where you work with your traditional allies and stand up strongly to an enemy like Iran, which is the leading state sponsor of terrorism, is that you can get more defense for least cost, and you can avoid getting dragged into another costly and inconclusive war like we've seen recently in the Middle East. And as someone who's fought in those wars, I would just submit to you that we need to be very careful about getting dragged into another war. And the best way to avoid that is to have a strong military that deters our enemies.
Candidate Stuck, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Well, I do think that Mike and I actually agree on something. I think certainly I would agree we don't want to get into another war. They're not sustainable. They cost outrageous amounts of money that we simply can't afford to get into wars that we aren't prepared for, that we don't have a strategy for. Unfortunately, Mike has supported Trump as he has tried to start wars through Twitter, has just thrown things out there on Twitter about how we are going to work with other countries or how we're going to work against them. That does not make us safer. The truth is, all you have to do is ask yourself, do you feel safer right now with this administration in power and at the lead? We are not safer. We have broken relationships with allies that we need to actually be safer. Most of our intelligence community has come out in support of Biden because they're saying that they don't trust Trump, that he doesn't read his briefings, that he can't be trusted. That does not make us safer. We have had record turnover at the National Security Council. How does that make us safer when there are always new people, when there's no consistency in terms of who is watching out for us? The truth is we are not safer right now. We need an adult in the room who will actually be able to negotiate, who will take this seriously, who will listen to our intelligence community.
All right, I want to thank you both for taking the time to answer the questions with civility and on time. Thank you. Very, very successful debate. Each of you is going to get now 3 minutes to give your closing statement about anything you'd like, and we're going to start with candidate Stuck.
Well, thank you again for hosting this, and I really do appreciate the questions that we had a chance to discuss tonight. And even though I am the Democratic candidate on here tonight, what I would say is that truthfully, I think my story probably represents what so many who are part of the conservative coalition would really claim to be their values. I am the candidate that came from two very poor parents. My mom was a waitress. My dad worked at a grocery store when I was born. I was the first out of my family to go to college. I worked 2 jobs at a time to put myself through school. I do remember days where I had $10 for the week and had to decide if I was going to eat that week or if I was going to put gas in my car to get to school and work. I worked incredibly hard to get through school, to get that degree. I clawed my way out of poverty to barely hold on to my place in the middle class because it is so incredibly hard to do. And I would say most conservatives would say that that's their value, hard work, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. I know what it takes to do it. I know how government can either make it harder to stay in the middle class or easier to stay in the middle class. We need people who really do understand that, who really live those values, who don't talk about them. We don't need more people who come from wealth and privilege, who don't understand what it's like to work for a living, who don't understand what it's like to try and get ahead when it's nearly impossible. I am the candidate that has that experience, that comes from a working background, who knows what it is like to stay awake in the middle of the night wondering how you're going to pay the mortgage or how you're going to get your business through another day. That is what we need. We need somebody who's committed to the people here because they don't have time for games. They don't have time for people who only care about their own political ambitions. I have won an award nationally for my bipartisan work here in Wisconsin with the Wisconsin Future Caucus. I am committed to working with people across the aisle. I will work with anybody who wants to work with me, and I will always put the people here in Wisconsin first above anything else.
Candidate Gallagher, you have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you for this, and thank you to my opponent for being part of this. I really enjoyed it. Earlier, it was asked whether I have ever had any experience with a constituent calling and being worried about having access to life-saving healthcare. And the truth is, I do. Over the past 4 years, one of the main things that my office has done is to help veterans who have struggled to get access to the care that they need from a, quite frankly, outdated VA infrastructure to ensure that they can survive, who are suffering both from the visible and the invisible wounds of war. And it's been my privilege to get them access to the care that they need. And I think you can measure the integrity and the greatness of a country by how it treats those who have put their lives on the line to defend the Constitution, defend American values, and defend the American flag. And every time that I attend an honor flight where we welcome home World War II and Vietnam veterans and Korean War veterans after a day of visiting in DC, back to Appleton and Green Bay, I am moved to see the next generation honoring that service, particularly for the Vietnam veterans who, quite frankly, didn't have that welcome when they came home, who were spit on for wearing their uniforms. I actually think we've come a long way, and that should make us all vigilant about protecting what we have in this country. Because the truth is, for all the problems we have, if you were born here, if you came here legally, however you got to America, you hit the jackpot if you're an American citizen. And I know that this flag behind me has become a symbol of controversy in recent years, but the reason I think it drives a lot of people crazy when people denigrate the American flag or kneel for the American flag is because this stands for some basic ideas that we used to all agree upon. And the fact is, right now in America, it's not an act of courage to bash the country. It's not an act of courage to burn that flag. An act of courage is what we've seen actually from peaceful protesters in Hong Kong, taking to the streets by the millions in defiance of tyranny. And what were they holding in their hands when they came out and risked their lives? The American flag. That should tell us something about the enduring power of this country and how we need to do everything possible to maintain our constitutional order and our freedoms. And so thank you for the privilege of being with you tonight. Thank you to my opponent, and God bless America.
I thank you both one more time, and I wish you the best of luck in the upcoming election. I urge Wisconsin citizens, all legally able to vote citizens, to get out and vote, do your civic duty, and we turn it over now for a final word to Ron Zahn.
Thank you, Dr. Pesta. The WCC thanks you, the concerned electorate of Northeast Wisconsin, for viewing this forum. Thanks especially to the candidates, not just for participating, but for putting their respective hats in the ring. Running for office can be grueling. There's risk in putting your thoughts out there for all to see and to being targeted. Thank you, candidates Gallagher and Stuck. Thank you also to the FPA for providing technical help and facilities for tonight's forum. Good evening.